Hello, everyone. As the inaugural director of the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you all to today's session of the Iranian Diaspora Studies Seminar Series featuring my distinguished colleague, Professor Amy Malek of Oklahoma State University, who will be speaking on culture beyond country, strategies of inclusion in the global Iranian diaspora. Iranian Diaspora Study Seminar Series is a collaborative initiative of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University, the Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies program at Oklahoma State University, and the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies. The series is co-convened with my colleagues, Professor Persis Karim of San Francisco State University and Professor Amy Malek of Oklahoma State University. I'm grateful to our co-conveners and their institutions for this significant initiative. I'm also grateful to our co-sponsors, the Canadian Society for Iranian and Persian Studies, Iranian Studies Student Forum, and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation, which has also generously supported the establishment of the Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. Before introducing Professor Malek, I would like to express our personal and collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge the land on which the Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, it has been the homeland of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to serve as the home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Dr. Nusha Keizad, will introduce Professor Malek, and Professor Persis Karim will moderate today's session. Dr. Keizad.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have the honor of introducing Professor Amy Malek, who is a sociocultural anthropologist specializing in migration, citizenship, memory, and culture with a focus on the Iranian diaspora. She's associate professor of Global Studies at Oklahoma State University, where she holds the endowed chair and serves as the director of the Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies program. Her forthcoming book, Culture Beyond Country, Strategies of Inclusion in the Global Iranian Diaspora, which will be published by NYU Press autumn 2025, draws on her 16 years of research, examining the distinct practices and experiences of Iranians in 3 key cities of the diaspora, being LA, Stockholm, and Toronto. Dr. Malek earned her PhD in anthropology at UCLA. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the Sharmin and Bijan Mosawwar Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton. Her peer-reviewed publications have appeared in journals such as the International Journal of Cultural Studies, Memory Studies, Middle East Journal, and Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Please welcome Professor Malek.
Thank you so much, Nusha John. Thank you to all of you for being here today. I want to thank Dr. Tabakoli especially, but also his colleagues at the Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at University of Toronto for hosting this seminar series on the Iranian diaspora, and especially for the kind of invitation to share with you a preview of my forthcoming book. It should be out in October, inshallah. So, Toronto is such an important site of the Iranian diaspora, and since I'm speaking to a University of Toronto audience, I want to start with a recollection from my fieldwork there that will focus a little bit more on the US case in the rest of this talk. So I want to start specifically at a place that's become very familiar to many Iranian Torontonians. Let me share my slide. All right, can we see? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. And that place, of course, is the Tirgan Festival. Good to see you, Mir-Djalali.
Thank you, Mehrdad.
Sorry.
I said, thank you, Mehrdad.
Yeah, thank you, Mehrdad. So, taking place every other July since 2008. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tirgan, this event has quickly become the largest biennial festival of Iranian arts and culture in the world. Many of you may have actually experienced, its summer date sometimes makes for a challenging weather situation. And indeed, on the opening day of the 2011 Tirgan Festival, only its second iteration, it happened to be the hottest day of the year in Toronto that year. The heat index soared to 46 degrees Celsius. That's 114 Fahrenheit for those of you in the States. And so during the opening ceremony, the humidity was stifling. And that year, I was working alongside the nearly 300 volunteers who regularly met a year in advance to make the Tirgan Festival a success. I was tasked with photographing the team at work, making note of areas for improvement, and especially the hours-long lineups of Iranian families, young newcomers, and non-Iranian Torontonians seeking entry into the free concerts, dance performances, film screenings, and poetry readings that populate the 4-day schedule. After 4 packed days that had brought out a record-breaking crowd of 130,000 attendees, that's 2011, now it's even higher, we know. On the closing evening, as festival goers lingered on the water's edge boardwalk, I came upon 2 volunteers who were busy packing a large van with materials that had decorated the tea house that year. Their sweat-drenched Tirgan logo t-shirts revealed the long day that they'd already had. One told me about the intense days and nights they'd worked over the last few weeks. She and others on her team had taken off work and missed shifts to prioritize their Tirgan duties, devoting long hours that had been challenging but also exhilarating. Her partner added that the logistics subcommittee had been giving rides nonstop to invited artists and guests from the airport and to and from hotels. He estimated they'd made about 70 such trips in just 3 days. Though tired, they shared a collective enthusiasm and sense of satisfaction. This festival had been an undeniable success thanks to their months of hard volunteerism. As they paused briefly for group photos and selfies, one volunteer looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I can't believe it's almost over. I wish it could last forever." Even as early as 2011, Tirgan had clearly become a passion project for hundreds of Iranian Canadians, mostly young professionals and graduate students who did not even get to watch much of the performances and lectures they had worked so hard to make possible. By 2023, an estimated 3,000 Iranian Canadians had served as Tirgan volunteers. Why had so many Iranian Canadians committed so much of their free time and even taken time off of their studies and full-time jobs as attorneys and tech professionals, architects and sales reps to start, plan, and run an arts festival? When I put this question to Maria, the festival's artistic director in 2011, she answered by recalling the beginning of her cultural work in the early 2000s, before she had completed her PhD in theoretical chemistry at the University of Toronto. She referred specifically to 2003, when Zahra Kazemi, a Canadian-Iranian photojournalist, had been killed in an Iranian prison. The news had led to a media maelstrom in Canada. Quote, "The papers were full of 'Iran kills journalist,'" she said, "Iran, Iran, Iran," and it was always continued by something negative. And I wrote this email to a news group of Iranians in Toronto and said, the name Iran itself, not necessarily just the government, is usually mentioned with something very negative, very ugly. Let's do something cultural. Let's put a face to this name, to this word, Iran. Because people can relate to culture quite easily. Let's just show another face of Iran. In the same period that Maria and her friends were embarking on cultural organizing in Toronto, Iranians in New York were organizing the first Persian parade, one of 180 ethnic parades to march down Manhattan's avenues each year, making it a key form of ethnic visibility in a multicultural city. Explaining their motivations for volunteering substantial time and resources for such an endeavor since 2004, Zohra, a lead organizer of the parade, echoed Maria as she described to me in 2009 the hypervisibility of a view of Iran in the media after 9/11 that had led to feelings of invisibility for Iranians in her community. She said, quote, "We want to show the Iranian community and that as a community we're very powerful and really should take pride in our achievement in this country. And also for American friends to see us in a different light, to see us, that we are a peaceful nation, that we come from a long heritage of civilization, that we're not the images that they see on TV. We're really not. And we're their friends, we're their neighbors, we're their doctors, their lawyers, their accountants, and they really, really should look at us in that light, not the way that the media has portrayed us in the last few years." In the course of 16 years of fieldwork from 2007 to 2003 and in over 125 interviews conducted with cultural organizers and community members in the Iranian diaspora in 3 different countries, I repeatedly heard from first-generation entrepreneurs and professionals that countering negative stereotypes and taking the reins of representation had motivated their participation in cultural organizing. Iranian immigrants from diverse political, ethnic, and professional backgrounds across the diaspora have worked to insert their own cultural representations in mainstream publics, not only to evangelize about a homeland, but specifically to correct what they viewed as misrepresentations that have resulted from and led to the misrecognition of Iranians in their diasporic homes. They especially have sought to reassert the dignity of Iranian identity in the face of over 4 decades of geopolitical tensions between governments in Iran and in the West that have contributed to their personal experiences of stigmatization, prejudice, and discrimination. While there are many ways to fight these exclusions and misrecognitions, in the period under study, I found that diaspora Iranians repeatedly were turning to culture as a strategy of inclusion in their multicultural societies. My forthcoming book, Culture Beyond Country, Strategies of Inclusion in the Global Iranian Diaspora, is a comparative transnational ethnography of Iranian diasporic cultural citizenship in Elahé, Stockholm, and Toronto. There, I examine how these processes of representing Iranian culture in the diaspora generates not only competing views on what it means to be Iranian, but also competing modes of belonging that variously subvert and reinforce existing power relations across local, national, and transnational scales. Across 5 substantive chapters, the book examines how Iranian immigrants in these 3 locations mobilized cultural production. And here I'm looking at festivals, parades, exhibitions, and public art to counter exclusion, shape public perceptions, and to build new forms of belonging. By tracing how Iranians have engaged with multicultural policies, media representations, and intra-community debates over inauthenticity, I show that culture has served as a critical strategy for negotiating inclusion in diaspora. While often framed as apolitical, and indeed organizers often explained their choice to turn to culture because it wasn't seen as political, these cultural projects are often deeply political, and in their efforts to reclaim representation, resist misrecognition, and especially in navigating the racial, social, and economic hierarchies of their societies. The argument of the book is presented in 5 chapters. Chapter 1, Departures and Arrivals, draws on interviews, national statistical data, and archival material to trace the global trajectory of Iranian emigration and immigration since the second half of the 20th century to the United States, Sweden, and Canada. It connects these migration flows to the experiments with multiculturalism that were taking place in each of these societies as Iranians began to arrive in large numbers. The following 3 chapters focus on each of the 3 cities under study, and through the lens of Iranian community-produced public art, exhibitions, and festivals, they each examine the strategies of inclusion that result from different approaches to and negotiations with multiculturalism. My light turned on. There we go. Okay. For example, in Chapter 2, Asserting Freedom, Dignity, and Wealth in Los Angeles, ethnographic attention is focused on the 2013 U.S. tour of the Cyrus Cylinder and in the 2017 Freedom Sculpture and Freedom Festival that it inspired in Los Angeles. It demonstrates how Iranian Americans, like other immigrants in the United States, are navigating neoliberal multiculturalism as an alternative pathway to power, centering notions of immigrant success and contribution, alongside nostalgic and nationalist renderings of Iranian culture to demonstrate good citizenship and thus deservingness for belonging. Given this context, I examine how and why certain forms of imperial nostalgia permeate so many Iranian American representations of culture and history. I'll return to this chapter in a moment. Unlike American neoliberal multiculturalism, however, Sweden's rapidly changing demographics and new approaches to official multiculturalism in the 1970s were reformed by the 2010s to prioritize cultural policies that tied financial and symbolic support to specific integration efforts. That led to Sweden's development of policies putting forward discourses of interculturalism, considered a bidirectional process in which both immigrants and the mainstream society adjust to one another, as opposed to the traditional one-way assimilation of immigrants into a hegemonic mainstream. This ideology was supported and expressed through cultural policies implemented in the 2010s by intermediary institutions like Sweden's National Touring Theatre and their representatives, including Iranian cultural workers hired into influential positions. These individuals not only brought professional arts experience and a mandate from the state, they also had the support of the state's budget and the intermediary institutions' networks and reputations within Swedish society and politics. In Chapter 3, then, Contesting Cultural Belongings in Stockholm, I trace how these professionals and their Iranian community volunteer partners created Eldfesten, a Charsh Misri festival that has aimed to represent Iranian arts and culture while also adhering to Swedish cultural policy imperatives of interculturalism. In my 2012 observations around the Eldfesten committee table, This approach included deliberately diversifying performances and inviting English and Swedish speakers as hosts and as audience. The result has been a popular annual celebration of Çarşambasuri as Eldfesten that looks very different from the holiday celebrated in Iran. This was among a number of complaints among some of the community members that led to contestations over notions of cultural ownership and authenticity in diaspora, which committee members responded to through direct reference to Swedish discourses of transparency, democracy, anti-racism, and diversity. Despite these disputes, the Çarşambasuri as Eldfesten event nevertheless has been successful in its quest to be recognized by Swedish officials as a Swedish tradition, and it has been broadcast live on national radio and TV and across the diaspora through digital media. Through a close reading of festival planning meetings, committee contestations, and interview material, the debates and controversies that I present in this chapter pivot on questions of authenticity and inauthenticity as it pertains to an idea of Iranianness, Irani Budan, as well as dual meanings of belonging, asking, for example, does cultural belonging as an inclusion in multicultural Sweden require immigrants to give up their cultural belongings as an ownership of Iranian culture? The chapter demonstrates how state intermediaries enacting cultural policies of Swedish interculturalism at the time challenged fellow Iranians to break away from nationalist and essentialist claims on culture, including imperial nostalgia, but also to practice, meaning to rehearse as much as to enact, Swedish ideals of democracy, inclusion, and transparency, and institutionalized norms of behavior. These practices and the debates the event sparked reflect the ways official Swedish multiculturalism in this period rewarded groups who aligned with hegemonic Swedish norms, whether by reproducing Swedish ideologies and behaviors or by innovating cultural events and practices that promoted the state's view of interculturalism through promotion of an expansive version of Iranianness as a strategy of inclusion. In Chapter 4, Navigating Multiculturalism in Toronto, I turn to the large and growing communities of Iranians in Toronto, where the Canadian multiculturalism mosaic model centers a top-down insistence that no cultural group, Indigenous, settler, colonial, or immigrant, is more or less Canadian than the other. This principle informed the state's 2000s to 2010s commitment to providing both symbolic and instrumental support for groups through programs that embedded principles of diversity in Canadian national identity. These policies succeeded in developing a common sense among Torontonians that demographic multiculturalism and the policies that support it have become matters of pride for Canada and for Toronto, an assertion that was made repeatedly by politicians and community members alike in the 2000s. It is also evident, for example, in the development of the city's popular summer ethnic festival tradition and the array of community partnership programs partially funded by federal and provincial resources that enabled them in that period and have now been reduced or sometimes even discontinued. One such partnership between young Iranian immigrants and Toronto's Harbourfront Centre enabled the creation of the biennial Tirgan Festival in 2007. By selectively drawing upon and reframing Iranian myth-historical traditions in its name and initial funding application, organizers very consciously sought to conform to Canadian multicultural priorities of diversity as a shared value for both Iranians and Canadians. Beyond Tirgan's name, this value also was realized through an energetic and motivated volunteer base of several hundred first-generation Iranian Canadians who worked to bring a diverse and contemporary view of Iranian arts and culture to Toronto. Tirgan's artistic programming, organizational structure, marketing strategies, and fundraising initiatives were deeply influenced by Harbourfront Centre and thus put forward Canadian norms of transparency, teamwork, and professional development as priorities equal to their mission of promoting Iranian art and culture, all while carefully maintaining nonpartisanship and refraining from divisive stances in order to bring together a fragmented community. The result has been the development not only of the largest festival of Iranian arts and culture in the world, but also of the Tirgan family, a network of fictive kinship that helped facilitate the integration of thousands of young Canadians into the Canadian way. As they volunteered alongside and for their new communities, they also built emotional attachments and deep feelings of belonging in Canada as Canadians. But Tirgan's alignment with Canadian multiculturalism has also meant that in moments of contestation, such as during social movements like #MeToo, where community members challenged Tirgan's commitment to non-political and nonpartisan stances, rather than take up community calls to resist hegemonic structures, the organization remained aligned with the organizational norms of the Canadian way. These have guaranteed not only a continuation of the status quo, but also additional support from government granting institutions and community donors who support these positions. That is until the Women Life Freedom Movement put the organization in a catch-22 that highlighted the very potent element of transnational belonging and commitments to compatriots in Iran, suggesting both the possibility of new strategies of resistance and the shift in motivations and priorities for a changing and growing diaspora. These 3 extended case study chapters are followed by a final chapter that draws together their insights and examples to offer a relational comparison of strategies of inclusion and their implications over this period of 16 years in the Iranian diaspora. In Chapter 5, Comparing Iranian Diasporic Strategies in Multicultural Societies, I identified different approaches to multiculturalism and immigrant inclusion in each of these 3 locations that have produced variation in approaches to representing and in many ways negotiating Iranian diaspora identity and inclusion. Acknowledging the many overlapping lines of belonging, the chapter especially highlights the lines of class, race, and religion, both within communities and in relation to their countries of reception. These comparative discussions ultimately demonstrate that across diasporic locations, those who work within and reinforce hegemonic forms have been best positioned to prevail. However, they also identify contestations and local variation that can also present openings for change. The book concludes with a consideration of how strategies of inclusion and belonging ultimately are acts of home building. As the examples in this book attest, cultural strategies of inclusion operate in conjunction with political, economic, and social strategies in multicultural societies. And as Iranian communities build ever greater attachments to their homes, they also experience ongoing migrations, react to shifting geopolitical and local circumstances, and navigate belonging in very creative ways. The book ends with a reflection on how these ongoing processes have opened conversations and challenged attitudes about race, class, and religion, not only in the mainstreams these public events seek to enter, but within their own communities. In the remainder of this preview, I want to zoom in on one section of Chapter 2 about the United States. As this audience is likely aware, though present across the multiple and widespread communities in the global Iranian diaspora, Iranian Americans have been especially prolific in didactic approaches of, quote, showing who we really are. This is due in part to the larger population in the United States and especially California, home to the largest population of Iranians outside of Iran. But it's also due in part to the greater ubiquity of quite negative representations stemming from the intense antagonism between the governments of the Islamic Republic and the United States since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and especially during the hostage crisis. This state-level antagonism was translated to the U.S. general population through the nightly primetime broadcasts of America Held Hostage, the precursor to Nightline that not only launched Ted Koppel's long career, but also put a particular set of images of Iran and of Islam on American televisions every single night for 444 nights until the hostage's release. This primetime nightly reminder stoked American fears and anger, which also spread to the streets, neighborhoods, and places of businesses where Iranian Americans were suddenly seen as enemies within. These messages didn't end with the resolution of the hostage crisis and were reinforced by pop culture, whether through books and films, like Of Course Not Without My Daughter, that screened not only in cinemas, but also on TV well into the 2000s, and even was screened in some American classrooms. We also see it in songs, sitcoms, jokes, bumper stickers, pins, and paraphernalia, all of which collectively contributed to a very common sense in the United States about Iran and Iranians as backward, as violent, dangerous, and most of all, America's #1 enemy. The string of political crises that followed the hostage crisis, including the Iran-Contra affair, the first Gulf War, and of course 9/11, repeatedly have reignited this common sense, confirmed most directly perhaps when President Bush declared Iran part of an axis of evil in 2002. But unlike in the 1980s, Iranian Americans in this period began to organize against these representations. In the 2000s, they did so in ways that are also reflective of a long history of public performances of ethnic identity by immigrant groups in the United States. Following the leads of Italian Americans, Irish, Greek, and Mexican Americans before them, and seeking to counter what they called Persian phobia, and seeking to shape how the world views Persians, as one interlocutor put it to me, Iranians have devoted extensive resources, time, and energy to display their visions of Iranian culture and history in large public spaces before non-Iranian audiences. I've observed, of course, these efforts at parades like those organized annually in New York since 2004 or in LA in 2015 and 2016, at public cultural festivals like the Mehrgan Festival of Autumn in Orange County, and in Westwood, their Nowruz block parties, at City Hall Nowruz celebrations like those presented each year in San Francisco, LA, Atlanta, and Orlando, at multicultural displays like the House of Iran at San Diego's Balboa Park Cultural Cottages, and at black tie dinner galas, at event elite venues like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where one organizing committee member was quoted by Vanity Fair magazine in 2015 saying, quote, "A guest came up to me and said he invited his American family members and friends. He told me he was pleased to be able to tell them, this is who we are, not what you read in the papers all the time." Sounds quite familiar, right? So taken together, the proliferation of festivals, parades, galas, exhibitions, public art, and street celebrations in the Iranian diaspora, especially perhaps in North America, contributed to a widespread phenomenon of strategically countering experiences of exclusion by turning to public performances of art and culture as arguments for inclusion. These cultural approaches of what I collectively term strategies of inclusion mark frustrated but determined responses to events both here in diaspora and there in Iran that led in part to the stigmatization of Iranians in popular media and everyday life in their diaspora homes. Inclusions and exclusions are subject to fluctuating power dynamics, such that notions like national identity, diaspora identity, and related modes of belonging become, in the words of Nira Yuval Davis, a, quote, naturalized construction of a particular hegemonic form of power relations, end quote. Numerous forms of power, including those influencing political legal processes of belonging among immigrants. Unlike in countries such as Sweden and Canada, which of course discuss at length in the book, the United States has never had a national multicultural policy to directly influence or support immigrant groups. In its place, a form of neoliberal multiculturalism emerged, especially since the 1990s, with messages and mythologies about the role and place of immigrants in American history and contemporary society. As Wendy Brown has demonstrated, the rise of neoliberalism has brought about state disinvestment in the public, but also withdrawal from society more generally. In the privatization, deregulation, and other economic strategies that are traditionally associated with neoliberal reforms, Wendy Brown shows that the aim has actually been to, quote, change the soul through neoliberalizing society itself, diminishing and denigrating dependency on the state and the very idea of society as a source of welfare and security. Instead, citizens are encouraged to become independent, quote, self-investors who, quote, socially and monetarily invest in themselves to become more valuable, end quote. In Iwa Ong's words, these immigrants are then therefore encouraged to become entrepreneurs of themselves. This entrepreneurializing of every institution, activity, and service includes, of course, cultural activities and institutions for immigrants as much as for other citizens. Relatedly, in her analysis of differentiated and cultural citizenship, Ong describes a dual process of self-making and being made, in which subject formation is negotiated between the state and the subject through state intermediaries such as universities, nonprofit organizations, social service providers, and cultural institutions who work to create self-regulating racialized subjects. In neoliberal subject formation, immigrant subjects vying for inclusion are expected to become self-entrepreneurs, not just in the financial, educational, or health aspects of their lives, but also in the social and cultural ones. In this iteration of multiculturalism, immigration policies are mobilized alongside national mythologies of the United States, for example, as a nation of immigrants seeking the American dream, accessible simply by pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. In this way, they are creating immigrant citizens whose identities as hyphenated Americans are both rooted in and dependent on the interlocking values of individual responsibility, self-sufficiency, and contributions to society. In this context, in an effort to navigate social and political inclusion, then, Iranian Americans are responding to these messages by employing a number of cultural strategies that have implications for Iranian identity well beyond American borders. In the book, I seek to understand why so many public expressions of Iranian identity in the US context have relied so heavily on imperial nostalgia, especially in cities like Los Angeles. I'm especially interested in the phenomenon of Iranian American imperial nostalgia that is seen as a wistful longing or affection for past empire, here the Achaemenid Empire, which is used to introduce what diaspora members term real Iranian culture and history to American audiences. I focus on one such strategy and an imperial nostalgia phenomenon I've termed Cyromania. As a 21st century diasporic fascination with the ancient Iranian past, Cyromania centers on the life and legacies of Cyrus the Great through the proliferation of artifacts, narratives, and symbols originally made popular during the revivalist period of the Pahlavi era. Though different from the phenomenon of 19th century Egyptomania in important ways, for example, in that its strongest proponents have been Iranians themselves, Cyromania has important parallels in how it shapes politics, identity, and racial ideas in diaspora. In their widespread and often larger-than-life invocations of Cyrus the Great, Iranian Americans are not only or simply parroting nationalist tropes in response to geopolitics. I argue they're also responding specifically to very American experiences of exclusion and assimilationist demands that require immigrant groups to render their own histories and cultures within an American neoliberal frame of multiculturalism. Diasporic Iranians undertaking these efforts draw on collective memory and a common set of cultural symbols and narratives. This symbolic repertoire, of course, includes the poetry of Rumi and Hafez, the heroes of the epic Shahnameh, holidays like Nowruz, and of course, its tenets attributed to a Zoroastrian heritage. And of course, the history of kings who established the Persian Empire, specifically this figure of Cyrus the Great. Since the 2010s, evidence of the symbolic power of Cyrus and Cyrus' cylinder has proliferated across high and popular culture. Clothing, jewelry, designer handbags, like this $700 clutch that sold out quite quickly, a commemorative memorabilia of various kinds have featured the Cyrus cylinder. Tattoos frequently highlight the Farbahar, and here we see one artistically rendered with Cyrus's profile. The children, businesses, and community organizations increasingly commemorate ancient heroes. Reproductions of ancient sites like Persepolis and Pasargadae and artifacts like the Cyrus cylinder appear not only on posters and at events themselves, but of course in Iranian homes and restaurants, from Toronto to Tokyo, Berlin to Berkeley. And efforts by Iranian Americans to install statues of Cyrus the Great in North American cities have also begun in earnest. I know in Toronto, but also in Los Angeles, and indeed in my hometown of Atlanta, where in 2023, a 9-meter statue of Cyrus the Great was erected on Cyrus the Great Day, which is October 29th, itself an invented tradition most Iranian Americans probably had never heard of just a decade ago. But Cyromania, as a spectacle of imperial nostalgia, is part of a broader global trend. In the mid-2010s, we saw Turkey's Erdogan staging reenactments and military parades celebrating the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. In Egypt, President Sisi orchestrated spectacles of revived Pharaonism, such as the Pharaoh's Golden Parade in 2021, which transported 22 royal mummies to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. As designed, these spectacles draw massive audiences and work toward both cultural and political goals, provoking shifts in nationalist imaginaries and identity. But the use of imperial nostalgia as a spectacle is hardly new. It, of course, has been attempted by numerous regimes across the 19th and 20th centuries, including, of course, Iran. In 1971, the Shah of Iran staged the 2,500-year celebration of the Persian Empire, commemorating Cyrus's founding of the Persian Empire. The celebration culminated decades of efforts to consolidate Pahlavi nationalism, first under Reza Shah, then under his son Mohammad Reza. Mohammad Reza had made Cyrus a centerpiece of national identity, fashioning him as a national hero through extravagant events like his 1967 coronation, scholarly conferences, and cultural productions highlighting the pre-Islamic past. The 2,500-year celebrations were held over 4 days at Persepolis, including feasts, light shows, and exhibitions. And in these events, the Shah aimed to, quote, reawaken the people of Iran to their past and reawaken the world to Iran, end quote. But the invitation-only events were closed to the general public, attended instead by foreign royals, celebrities, and dignitaries, and their extravagance is often counted among the tipping points that led to the Shah's fall less than 8 years later. At the opening event at the tomb of Cyrus the Great, the Shah famously tied the Pahlavis to the Persian Empire by placing himself as the descendant of a 2,500-year uninterrupted line of Iranian kings. On the final day of the celebrations, the ceremony opened the newly completed Shahyad Tower, now Azadi Tower, in the center of Tehran, where a new museum of Persian history featured a display of the Cyrus cylinder, the first time it would appear in Iran on loan from the British Museum. The cylinder was made the center of the official seal of the 2,500-year celebrations, as well as centered on stamps, medals, and coins minted for the occasion. And the focus on Cyrus continued when in 1976, the Shah went so far as to change the official Iranian calendar to begin with the accession of Cyrus the Great in 559 BCE, rather than the Hijra of Muhammad, shifting the year from 1355 to 2535 overnight. The long-term impact and the collective effect of this vast field of cultural production on Iranian national identity has been significant. Because as ever-present as he seemingly has become in a current period of Cyromania, historians have shown that Cyrus was not regarded by most Iranians as their ancestral national hero prior to these 20th century events. He is absent in key cultural sources like the Shahnameh and had been unremarked upon by revered Persian language poets and historians for centuries. So minimal was the role of Cyrus and these related sites prior to the opening of the 1971 celebrations that the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae was described in official documents at the time as, quote, a lonely, plundered, almost forgotten place left to lizards, end quote. Scholars have suggested that the impetus for the modern project to fashion Cyrus the Great as a national hero was less likely to have been a desire to recuperate Iranian history, though it undoubtedly involved that, and more of one to create a politically useful heroic figure familiar and amenable to the modern and largely Western values, ideologies, and ideologies that Pahlavi elites sought to promote. Specifically, this narrative asserted that Cyrus the Great had enacted the first Declaration of Human Rights and was the first leader to promote ideas such as religious tolerance, diversity, and individual freedoms. Buttressed by accounts from the ancient Greeks and by favorable translations of the Cylinder, in this interpretation, the Cylinder confirmed the biblical accounts of Cyrus's freeing of the Jews in the book of Ezra, even if the Cylinder never mentions the Jewish faith or people by name. The interpretations of key lines of the Cyrus Cylinder continue to be debated, especially claims that Cyrus abolished slavery as a practice, and that the Cylinder should be read as the first charter or declaration of human rights. Citing scholarly accounts and histories from the 1920s, archaeologist John Curtis has shown that while the Cylinder was understood upon its 19th century discovery in present-day Iraq, remember it was found in Babylon, to hold significance due to its description of Cyrus's taking of Babylon and its outlining of a genealogy, it was not recognized at the time for any connections to contemporary understandings of freedom, human rights, or democracy. That argument only emerges in the 1960s, when it was advocated by Iranian elites, publicists, state officials, and of course the Shah himself. For example, at the opening of the first United Nations Conference on Human Rights held in Tehran in 1968. There, the Shah referred to the Cyrus Cylinder as, quote, the precursor to the modern Universal Declaration of Human Rights, end quote. He made the same claim again in 1971 during the 2500-year celebrations. And while these events were taking place in Iran, in New York, the Shah's sister, Princess Ashraf, presented an exact replica of the Cyrus Cylinder to the then Secretary General of the UN, describing Cyrus's legacy, quote, as one of human understanding, tolerance, courage, compassion, and liberty, end quote. That replica still sits in a glass case on the second floor of the UN Secretariat and continues to be referenced by Iranians in diaspora to demonstrate Cyrus's founding role, and by extension, Iranians' role in the development of human rights as defined and enshrined by that same international institution. Yet, as Curtis and other scholars have long argued, the Cylinder was never intended as a declaration of human rights, nor did such a concept exist in Cyrus's time. Even as those claims were being popularized, anti-Pahlavi activists in the 60s and 70s, including at the same 1968 UN Conference on Human Rights in Tehran, were pointing to the hypocrisy of promoting freedom and tolerance as Iranian values at the same time that the Shah's secret police were actively suppressing ethnic minorities and imprisoning and torturing political opponents. Nevertheless, this marketing of Cyrus, his Cylinder, and the Persian Empire to Iranians in the world through these kinds of public relations projects, scholarly publications, and conferences was so effective precisely because most Iranians did not know much about this historical period prior to the emergence of this field of cultural production. The pervasive repetition of these narratives and symbols through imperial nostalgia and the 21st century Iranian diaspora reveals how powerful 20th century nationalist symbolism has remained. But it also demonstrates how these significations have been mobilized in new contexts with new meanings, where new traditions around enduring symbols of ancient Iranian empire have proven very useful. We can see it quite clearly in the public displays of Cyromania Iranian Americans have produced, whether through large 3D replicas and photo ops of Cyrus's tomb in Southern California, in reenactments of the Parade of Soldiers at the 2500-year celebrations in the New York Persian Parade on Madison Avenue, or the use of Achaemenid architecture as features and backdrops for concerts, festivals, and wineries in California. Most recently, we've also seen it at political protests. This past February, Cyrus emerged with his Cylinder to lead a group of monarchist protesters at the Munich Security Conference. You might have seen some of these images online. For many Iranian Americans, imperial nostalgia offers a form of relief against stigmatization, political stereotyping, and media portrayals that have created a troubling common sense about Iranians as Islamic fundamentalists, terrorists, or enemy others of the US. They've recognized the symbolic power of the story of Cyrus, especially as a benevolent ruler of empire and the purported founder of human rights. This story has taken its perhaps most powerful form in the tale of Cyrus as the ideological father of American democracy. In this version, Cyrus is seen as an inspiration to Western philosophers and politicians, especially Thomas Jefferson. This chain of claims that Cyrus the Great was the founder of human rights, that Thomas Jefferson was directly inspired by Cyrus the Great, and thus that Cyrus the Great was fundamental to the crafting of American democracy, is now consistently repeated in the United States. But it first began to emerge in Iranian American cultural production in the 2000s and gained mainstream attention during the 2013 US tour of the Cyrus Cylinder. On loan from the British Museum, the Cylinder made 5 stops at elite museums like the New York Met, the Smithsonian in DC, and the Getty Villa in LA, in partnership with and co-sponsored by Iranian American organizations in each city. The exhibition featured the Cyrus Cylinder alongside ancient artifacts, and in the Smithsonian exhibition, Thomas Jefferson's annotated copy of Xenophon's Cyropedia, which is a fictionalized biography of Cyrus written around 370 BCE. The book's presence in the libraries of U.S. founding fathers like Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin was used as supporting evidence for, quote, the importance of Cyrus to those who wrote the Constitution of the United States, end quote. And this made the case for why Cyrus the Great should be regarded as important by elite American institutions and their hundreds and thousands of American visitors. The exhibition not only sought to demonstrate a global acceptance of the ancient Iranian roots of all these abstract notions that had been attributed to the cylinder in the late 20th century, but also specifically American acceptance of the worthiness of Iranians in the present day, especially those who now live in the United States. Cyrus the Great was presented as the source of American values and liberal ideals, and thus a pre-modern contribution by contemporary Iranians as the heirs of Cyrus. The then executive director of the Farhang Foundation, who was the community's co-sponsor for the Cylinder's LA stop, made this connection explicitly when she told the LA Times the Cyrus Cylinder, quote, is important because of the ideals it represents that say who we really are. Non-Iranians can get to know the Iranian culture and its people in the correct light, rather than the portrayals in the media that we hear every day, end quote. Through Cyrus the Great, Iranian Americans put forward an argument that they should no longer be rendered as enemies within, but as the original ideological donors to the very fabric of American identity. This presentation of an ancient Persian artifact and its legacy in American history thus also suggested a new beginning for the representation of Iranians and Iranian Americans in the United States. Revising an American collective memory that marks the beginning of the U.S.-Iran relationship in 20th century political events, whether the hostage crisis, the revolution, or the 1953 overthrow of Mossadegh. Here, a new beginning was located in the ancient reign of Cyrus the Great, allowing for a much earlier and friendlier relationship forged in a perceived ideological kinship. That perception relied as much on shared mythologies of benevolent empire as on the willingness to ignore the fundamental contradictions between liberal pronouncements of human rights and the illiberal actions of the leaders who pronounced them, whether the Shah, Thomas Jefferson, or otherwise. But there can be no doubt that this approach was successful in garnering attention. Over 400 news outlets reported on the exhibition, helping to draw in over 315,000 visitors over its 9-month tour. When it arrived at its final stop at the LA Getty Villa Museum, Angelenos attended the Cylinder exhibition in droves. It was reported at the time as the most well-attended exhibit in the museum's history, which was only surpassed in 2022 by another exhibit about ancient Persia. We go to our exhibitions in LA. Dozens of school groups contributed to the high attendance figures. Iranian American families especially turned out, and some came from across the country lining up for hours with their non-Iranian colleagues and friends to bear witness. Once inside, many Iranian Americans were moved to tears in front of the small cylinder in its glass case, feeling through it pride and honor that had been denied them for decades in the U.S. The experience was extremely emotional for many, as one attendee told a reporter, quote, I burst into tears. I got so excited and something inside me just reacted. I don't know, maybe it's Iranian blood. Iranian Americans with these deeply emotional responses found in the exhibition confirmation of their identifications with Cyrus the Great, but also confirmations of the ideas ascribed to the cylinder during childhoods in Iran long before their migration. If Cyrus, as an icon representing the essence of Iranian identity, had influenced Jefferson, an icon representing the founders of American democracy, then in this exhibition, Iranian Americans, their American-born children, and their non-Iranian neighbors all were confronted with evidence not only of the importance of Cyrus, but of an ancestral Iranian goodness that had contributed to America before these immigrants even arrived at its shores. While the large number of attendees and article placements in popular media, and of course shares on social media, offer basic metrics as to the success of the tour, they only partially reveal the impact of these kinds of projects and the Cyromania that ensued. Among them, just 3 years after the exhibition concluded, in 2017, a large public sculpture directly invoking the Cyrus cylinder and its diasporic significance was unveiled in Los Angeles. Titled Freedom, a Shared Dream, or simply the Freedom Sculpture, the story of this monumental sculpture offers a clear demonstration of Syromania as a strategy of inclusion, and of all the hopes and future possibilities that many Iranian immigrants place in the American values articulated by a neoliberal form of multiculturalism. Described as sitting at the most prestigious and highly trafficked heart of LA, the Freedom Sculpture is a 10-ton, 16-foot-tall modernist interpretation of the Cyrus cylinder. It sits on a median strip of the 10-lane-wide Santa Monica Boulevard. The large thoroughfare was unprecedentedly closed to vehicle traffic for the Freedom Festival, a free 4th of July celebration and concert to gift the sculpture to the city. Both the sculpture and this professionally produced festival were projects of Farhang Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in LA with a mission to celebrate and promote Iranian art and culture, quote, for the benefit of the community at large, end quote. The organization had also been the local co-sponsors of the LA stop of the Cylinder Tour. Its leaders described the importance of the Freedom Sculpture to the press in the days leading up to its big reveal with reference to the same ideas put forward by that exhibition. The Freedom Sculpture, quote, is a precious gift from our community to the most diverse city in the U.S. as a permanent reminder of the ideas of liberty, tolerance, and multiculturalism, which was espoused by Cyrus the Great over 2,500 years ago. The same ideas that were later adopted by the founding fathers of the U.S. and enshrined in our Constitution, end quote. Throughout the 4th of July event, these ideas were repeated on stage by politicians and organizers as fundamental not just to Americans, but also and originally to Iranians. A founding trustee of Farhang emphasized this to the Huffington Post when he said, quote, these rights are not only part of our heritage, they came from us, end quote. Farhang's emphasis on Iranian American contributions as cultural gifts reflects an approach long deployed by other immigrant and minority groups seeking inclusion in U.S. national identity and its attendant racial hierarchy. For example, in the mid-20th century, Italian Americans had invoked their ancestor Christopher Columbus as among their many contributions to the United States, ultimately winning his commemoration in statues across the country and in a federally recognized national holiday, one that is now, of course, hotly contested. As historian Danielle Battisti has shown, Italian Americans effectively mobilized rhetorics of contributionism and immigrant gifts in their efforts to seek dignity and honor in the face of anti-Italian stereotypes and discrimination. They had done so by arguing that Italian Americans, starting with Columbus, had helped transplant, quote, Western civilization to the Americas, end quote, especially in what she termed the Republican traditions of ancient Rome, the roots of Christianity, and the cultural spirit of the Renaissance, all of which were fundamental to Americanism. Notably, Italian Americans did not resist the discrimination faced by all immigrants at the time, nor the racialized system that had excluded them as non-white. Contributionism as a minority discourse has always been informed and in many cases limited by racial and class politics. As strategies for inclusion, contributionist claims have been successful for Ellis Island immigrants like Southern and Eastern Europeans, while failing to produce equivalent results for others like Chinese Americans or Mexican Americans. Despite this, Iranian Americans continue to use contributionism in their responses to government securitization and negative media representations of Iranians. Like Italians before them, in order to demonstrate deservingness for belonging in the U.S., Iranian American leaders historically have appealed less to common cause with other immigrants, including other Middle Eastern Americans, or even to legal codes that should protect their rights. Instead, prevailing arguments have highlighted assertions of high socioeconomic class status, immigrant exceptionalism, and, as with the Cyrus Cylinder exhibition, shared ideals of tolerance and diversity with mixed results. To be sure, the diasporic uses of these symbols are also not separate from their uses in Iran. And for many in diaspora, reasserting these histories and symbols in the face of Islamic Republic erasure has served as an act of resistance in the political battle over cultural history and collective identity. In this way, imperial nostalgia for a pre-Islamic Iranian past has simultaneously served as an explicit counter to the influence of Islam on Iranian culture, and also in diaspora as a counter to the racialization of Iranians by Americans as non-white and in many cases as Muslim. These are neither unrelated goals nor coincidental impulses. Expressions of Iranian identity as Aryan were central to 20th century Pahlavi nationalism and have emerged in 21st century America to not only put forward a proud national ancestry in the face of exclusion, but also to stake out a racial position seeking proximity to whiteness in the U.S. racial hierarchy. This is accomplished in part by distancing Iranian Americans from the Islamic Republic and thus from Islam, and from the increasingly virulent post-9/11 discourses against Muslims. At best, this distancing is a covering strategy. at its worst, it is expressed publicly by some Iranians in diaspora as anti-Muslim racism. Indeed, the prevailing arguments by Iranian Americans into the 2020s have continued to highlight shared liberal ideals of tolerance and diversity, assertions of high socioeconomic class status, and immigrant exceptionalism, while remaining relatively quiet on questions of racism or discrimination against other groups in the U.S. So what drives this continued confidence in the redeeming power of the rhetoric of immigrant contributions? The sculpture and large festival marking its unveiling were expressions of all the hopes and future possibilities that many Iranian immigrants place in the American values articulated by neoliberal multiculturalism. Iranian communities in the greater LA area, considered by many to be the capital of the diaspora, provides an exemplary case of neoliberal subject formation. Without the symbolic or instrumental benefits of directed public support provided for immigrant communities in countries like Sweden or Canada, Iranian Angelenos have sought to develop belonging through promotions of imperial nostalgia, neoliberal interpretations of exceptional entrepreneurial and economic success, and celebrations of their immigrant gifts to the United States. The result is an Iranian-American cocktail of nationalist interpretations of Iranian history and culture with U.S. assimilationist and neoliberal multiculturalist ideas about diversity, race, and class. It perhaps was telling that of all the possible quotes attributed to Cyrus the Great in the Cyropedia, the organizers of the Freedom Festival highlighted the following on large LED screens: freedom, dignity, wealth. These three together constitute the greatest happiness of humanity. The same quote was used that year by then President Trump in his Nowruz message, which said Cyrus the Great, a leader of the ancient Persian Empire, famously said that freedom, dignity, and wealth together constitute the greatest happiness of humanity. These appeals in form and function are emblematic of American forms of multiculturalism where freedom and dignity are deeply intertwined with wealth, which then fosters certain kinds of claims over others. Neoliberal appeals to diversity and tolerance bring favor to those who have the resources to espouse it, but without requiring the policies to provide support for meaningful equity under the trappings of inclusion. These strategies reveal a belief among many Iranian Americans, sometimes articulated explicitly, that immigrants who have successfully attained equal status in American identity, including racial identity, have earned that inclusion. In this line of thinking, they've done so not by virtue of their legal rights as humans or even as citizens, but by contributing to American society, thereby earning equal rights and high status. In other words, they believe that contributions of Iranians haven't been adequately recognized, for if they had, and if they can make them so, then Iranian Americans would not continue to be stereotyped as terrorists or extremists, would not continue to be targeted by government agencies like Homeland Security, would not continue to face employment discrimination, and would not be separated indefinitely from their family members, missing weddings, funerals, and graduations. In short, they would be treated with dignity as equal U.S. citizens. This approach is reflective of at least two processes: a neoliberal construction of citizenship in the U.S. that has highlighted immigrant contributionism as a strategy for inclusion as full members, and a related contest between and among diaspora leaders and cultural producers over who owns culture, who controls representation, and ultimately who belongs and how. Neoliberal language of productivity, personal responsibility, self-regulation, and contribution permeate many immigrant understandings of U.S. citizenship and processes of U.S. subject formation. Consequently, when the nation of immigrants turns against certain immigrants, whether through discrimination or outright bans, the common sense reaction by many Iranians has not been to see themselves as one among an array of racialized minorities in a common struggle for equal rights, but rather to respond through citations of exceptional academic achievement, economic success, and to ancient cultural contributions to American values as markers of their deservingness. To conclude, from the enormous 3D renderings of Cyrus the Cylinder in parades to innovative celebrations of Cyrus the Great Day on October 29th, new meanings and traditions have emerged around nostalgia for enduring symbols of ancient Iranian empire in new geopolitical and cultural contexts. Rather than dismiss Cyromania and imperial nostalgia in diaspora as purely nostalgic or purely ideological, I consider Cyromania primarily as a strategy of inclusion in competitions in diaspora. In these uses, imperial nostalgia clearly aligns a view of Iran's historical stature as a benevolent Persian empire with a similar view of the contemporary U.S. empire. It has emerged and operates within neoliberal forms of power. Rather than making a case for inclusion as enactments of equality and basic human rights, the principles attributed to the narratives of Cyrus the Great, after all, these efforts instead traffic in the history of Cyrus to feed American assimilationist demands and to affirm the integrity of the American project, including who belongs as American and why. In other words, community members have had to bootstrap their own inclusion by putting forward ancient Iranian history and culture as testimony to contemporary Iranian Americans' moral goodness through their contributions to American ideals, mythologies, and hegemonic structures, even if those structures had not effectively guaranteed Iranian American inclusion from the outset. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amy. I'm always delighted by your supporting photographs because some of it looks so absurd now, given what's happening in the United States, for example. So I'm going to ask a question and then I'm going to open it to others because I know we have limited time. But I wonder if you could comment a little bit, because while I find your argument and your evidence very compelling, one of the things that I see absent is a conversation about what's happening within the diaspora, particularly among different generational tensions that have exhibited, especially since the Woman Life Freedom movement. And also, if you can look in your crystal ball and see how the erasure of the Persian Gulf might impact some of these same mobilizations for representation and inclusion. So that there's kind of two very different strands. But one of the things that I observe is that there are tensions within Iranian communities around different generations of Iranian Americans. For example, I can only speak really effectively to the US, about like, whose story is this? Whose myth is this? And especially as younger people have become more conscious of imperialism's dangers. So I wonder if you could comment on that and then look into your crystal ball.
Thank you for that, Persian. I've learned not to try to predict anything when it comes to politics, especially, but certainly among our community, what will come and what won't. But I appreciate your comments, and certainly across the global diaspora, generational differences are, of course, present. In every immigrant community, we have generational distinctions and different ideas about nationalism, about identity, about immigrant belonging. In this presentation, I've tried to kind of give a preview of the book that really focused very much on first generation efforts in a particular window of time, right? This is the 2000s and 2010s. As you said, looking at it from 2025 is a very interesting exercise in kind of thinking how things have really changed. And that was one of the things I really appreciated about the opportunity to have a long-term view, right? That anthropologists require long-term field work, long-term engagement. I've been going back to the Tirgan Festival every year, right? I go back and forth to LA all the time. I try to stay very much engaged with what's going on in each of these places, as hard as that is to do, because things change over time, and because you're able to see maybe something different when you look back later on a particular time. So even at the time when I was doing some of this very, very early parts of this field work, I'm a second generation Iranian American, right? So I was speaking to first generation members of the community who were of a certain cohort, you know, folks who came in the 70s and 80s. First generation could be people who came yesterday, right? But this is very much thinking about Iranian diaspora members who were my parents' generation or just younger. And so that was something that was has become quite clear in that the interviews I was doing in the 2000s, especially directly after 9/11, especially during the Green Movement, especially during periods of 2015 and 2016, and during these heightened moments of geopolitical tensions, you can really see how motivations for organizing, for trying to build united communities in very fractious moments, often have been we're turning to culture to do it, right? And so that's where the kind of motivation for this thread of the argument comes from. But yeah, if you ask someone who arrived to the United States in 2020, they may have a very different view of what is important to do, what would motivate them to organize and how they might go about doing it. But a lot of the folks that I spoke with and that I have been following were responding to what was going on in those moments. So I'm very careful in the book to put the year of people's, comments or when I interviewed them, because things change a lot. To your point about the Persian Gulf, this is something that, I don't know if there could have been a statement that could have so quickly united so many Iranians of different persuasions than to say you want to rename the Persian Gulf. That's been something that I've also seen, even in the 2000s, in the Persian Parade in like 2005, there was a float about keep the Persian Gulf Persian. This has been something that the community has been aware of and been invested in for a long time. But no, I will have to resist your temptation to look in the crystal ball.
I want to encourage people to raise their hands, and then I'll just call on you because there's a lot of people in this Zoom chat. So if you want to comment or ask Amy a direct question, Parveen John. Parveen, you unmute yourself, please. Okay.
Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity. The first question is that I would love to buy this book, not one copy, but 2 copies, so I could give one of them to a local library. So I am in California, so Dr. Tavakkoli, if you be kind enough to just send me the link that I could purchase that. What you did and what you are doing, it is wonderful. It is great. Me in the Fresno, I am doing the same thing. And we have a Persian language class and we celebrate Mehregan, Tirgan, Yalda, Nowruz, and all of those. And sometimes we try to have it in both language. And I would love to be connected to those people who are celebrating so wonderful in the other part of the world. So I could do that much better than what I am doing. And I think it is amazing because when the new generation, when they come, things like come off lost. And it is good to know about the culture and to be appreciated. And I have the first-hand experience that how it will give them self-esteem and boost their moral. We have long time ago some students who bring the food from home for a school. They will hide themselves under the table and eat the Persian food because it was different. Now it is completely different. Iranian people in Iranian are children. They are proud to go everywhere and say they are Iranian, and they are proud of their culture. And thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. I will end my question and comment.
Parveen John, if you look in the chat, Amy has put the link for the book order at NYU Press, but it's not available until October. Java Jun, your turn.
Hello, may I take a 2 seconds outside of the context to say hello to Dr. Azam Khatam, who kindly accepted to talk to Iranian Association of Boston, of which I am a member. It's good to see you again. Dr. Malek, I applaud you so much. I will read your book, and when I read your book, these are what I will look for. I will look for how deeply you went in the debate on the famous cylinder, because I want to tell you, you are very brave. Second, you are very kind. When I read Richard Fry's translation of that cylinder, that was how many years ago? I still have not dared to tell my friends that Ashraf Pahlavi's translation might be a little bit off. So I applaud you for that. I really applaud you for that. There is, I don't know if you had a chance, I want to know if you had a chance to talk to immigrants who might not be called first generation. These would be older generation who came because their only children are now here in the West. Did you have any encounter with them or any record of them? I stop here. Thank you very much. It was fantastic presentation. I am really glad I showed up.
Thank you so much for coming and for those comments. I have to put on my steel whenever I give this talk because I know people have very strong opinions about these things, and that's okay. I find that very interesting. That's why I'm interested in the topic, is that people are invested in these stories, and stories have so much power. To your question, I haven't interviewed specifically our elders who have arrived for that purpose, though I was very lucky as a child to have my own grandparents come from Iran for that purpose. So it's very much something I'm interested in, but I haven't yet done that study. I hope someone is doing that study because it is very interesting. But I thank you so much for that question.
Neilsha.
Thank you so much, Amy John, for your wonderful, thoughtful talk. I am also really looking forward to reading your forthcoming book. I really appreciated your perspective on these sorts of diasporic spaces that you think and have shown as sort of cultural spectacle, which is really fascinating. I'll be thinking more about that. So in your view, how should scholars approach these sorts of this sort of diasporic mobilization of ancient empire, neither maybe dismissing them or romanticizing them? What sort of interpretive frameworks allow us to hold that tension? And also, in your research, did you come across, or do you can you maybe comment on how we might shift diasporic memory? Is there sort of attention paid to this shared struggles with other racialized groups and communities that maybe emphasize the shared struggle rather than the sort of Iranian Persian exceptionalism? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisha. I appreciate the question. Yes, so my approach to this has not been an effort to try to dismantle nor to support what I've observed, right? It's kind of coming with a inquisitive, a curious mind and seeing that so many people are deeply invested, not only emotionally, but also financially, and spending so much time and energy towards promoting certain ideas and certain narratives. And so I take that very seriously. And I think anthropology has given us a lot of tools to do that, to recognize patterns and try to better understand them through ethnographic methods and try to take seriously the investments of the people that we're interested in better understanding. So that's been my framework for understanding, has been through kind of that ethnographic lens. In terms of shifting diasporic narratives and thinking about shared struggle rather than exceptionalism, that's been an interesting question that has come up a couple of times, and how I have been thinking about this in comparative ways. So the other kind of challenge methodologically for me has been having 3 field sites and like trying to do justice to 3 different locations that, despite what some folks may think, are not the same, right? That, there's an idea that like immigrant groups are the same because they all come from the same place, but certainly not. I think those in this room can probably very easily attest that it is the LA community and the Toronto community have a lot of differences and important distinctions. And one of those kinds of differences may indeed be that idea of exceptionalism is a little bit stronger in the US than it is in other parts of the diaspora. I haven't tried to make that claim because the work that I did was not really trying to do that, to make that argument and find evidence for it. But I can say that anecdotally, that has been a stronger line of argumentation that I've heard in the US than I have heard in Sweden or that I've heard in Canada. It exists, across the diaspora. I don't want to say that it doesn't, but in terms of scale, perhaps you have a point there. And some of our colleagues in American studies have been doing some of that work to try to really look at American exceptionalism as it expresses itself through American immigrant groups and their kind of navigations for collective identity and belonging. So yeah, that's definitely a key piece. Thank you for your question.
Pam Karimi, is that Pamela?
Yes, that's me. Hi.
Hi.
First is I apologize, Amy. I can't turn on my camera, but I just wanted to thank you for the wonderful presentation. I learned so much, and I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. Amy, I have a couple of questions. Feel free to respond briefly. The first question is, Amy, in your studies, how much comparative analysis did you have to do? Like, in other words, did you have to look at, for example, Indian diaspora, Arab diaspora, and compare and contrast it with Iran? And if you did, what was the outcome of this comparative method? And then the second question is, as much as, I wanted to be that is very much dedicated to the homeland, there are also Iranians who don't participate in any of these. And I wonder if they came up in any of your research. And then third question and final question, because I study art, I'm very interested, of course, in Iranian diasporic artists. And how much of your work was dedicated to the arts? I know that you did give us some great examples, but apart from the ones that celebrate Iranian national identity, did you also engage with Iranian artists who are just trying to use their craft to promote Iranian culture and Iranian identity? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate these questions, especially coming from our art expert. I'll start with the first question. The comparative analysis that I did was very much within the diaspora. So comparing communities within the Iranian diaspora with one another, as opposed to comparing beyond the Iranian diaspora. That is work that we absolutely need in Iranian diaspora studies. And it's something that I hope is on the agenda of a lot of our PhD students. I tried to see Iranians as one among immigrant groups. And so you saw the comparison with Italian Americans is probably the closest one that I end up doing in the book in the US case. But I was not setting out to do comparative across immigrant groups outside of the Iranian case. So if that's what you're looking for in this book, I'm afraid I won't be able to provide that. But doing the comparative within the diaspora and across multiple locations is what I ended up doing in this book. And in terms of the arts, there is definitely a lot of very interesting work being done by Iranian diaspora artists that are working very much against the narratives I've put forward today, who are absolutely not participating in this kind of representation. So I take that absolutely that point, and there are people who are working on that, including yourself. I know. I wanted to focus more on the public events that are free and open to the public, rather than like ticketed events or in gallery spaces or things like that. So that's why I focused more on, in this case, the Cyrus tour and on the Freedom Festival and the sculpture, because it's a piece of public art. And in the case of Sweden, as an open public festival. In the case of Toronto and Tirgan, as a public open, mostly free events. So that was why I chose the kind of public events that I did, rather than specific pieces of art or specific artists and the work that they're doing in these kinds of general areas. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Sarah?
And I didn't unmute. Thank you, Persis John, and thank you, Amy Hassan Abashi. I am so excited for this book, and it can't come soon enough. Congratulations on getting it to us soon, I hope. I also just want to echo what everyone said about what a massive undertaking this must be. As someone who's lived outside of Iran for like almost 2 decades now and still can't think of myself as diaspora. I don't know what it means to start thinking about diaspora. So again, looking to all your insight. In the interest of time, I have so many questions, but I'm just going to keep it to one because I know there's also questions for you in the chat. I just wanted to kind of ask, I'm really interested if you at all in your work dig into how people negotiate a shared understanding of Iranian art and culture. This especially came up for me as you were talking about the Tirgan Festival. And I'm particularly interested in how they come to reach consensus in terms of performance and the staging process, because in and of itself, like aside from what is that culture, but then how are we going to negotiate what the performance is going to be? How do we get into the process of putting together, like be it rehearsals or kind of really coming to an understanding of what is going to be performed, what is going to be staged? And I'm just curious if you could expand on that, if your work deals with it at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. At the risk of answering a question that Mir-Djalali could probably answer better than me, since he's been the one trying to make those decisions, I'll do my best, and then maybe he can jump in if I've misrepresented something. My focus was less on what was on stage, honestly, and more on the production side, more on how people were working together, what they were prioritizing in these meetings. I sat in on 2 different groups, volunteer groups of their meetings for several months leading up to the 2011 festival. And my notes were less about like who's going to be on stage and more on the way that meetings were being conducted and how they were so attentive to things like agenda setting, deadline setting, sharing speaking time, making sure that there was equal contribution from all members of the committee, this commitment to the democratic process. That all to me was quite fascinating, just thinking about community organizing. So I was more thinking about that side of things. Of course, I'm also interested in what's on stage and thinking about how that's coming across to audience members and the kind of performance angle. But from what I was most interested in was really about like the actual doing of making a festival. So I won't speak as much to that, but I do think that this idea of a shared understanding of arts and culture was something at that time, and maybe it's changed because I haven't been involved in the volunteer side of things for quite some time, but at that time was very much about putting forward a vision of Iranian culture as contemporary, as what's happening right now, as what's new, what's fusion, what's creative, what's innovative. And that was very much in line with what Harborfront Center wanted its community partners to do, to put forward a contemporary view of art and culture, and to, in many cases, bring artists from origin countries to perform on Toronto stages. In our case, in the Iranian diaspora case, doing that sometimes has been successful and sometimes is quite difficult, right, to bring folks from Iran for lots of reasons. But as a result, like if you did a comparative of what you see at Tirgan or what you have seen at Tirgan, especially in the 2010s, compared to what you saw in festivals in other parts of the United States, was a very different picture of Iranian arts and culture, actually. Tirgan had funding, had resources, and had a kind of mission through this community partnership to make sure that the vision of Iranian art and culture was a contemporary one that wasn't focused so much on the ancient past. You won't see a 3D replica of Persepolis on the grounds of Tirgan, even if it might be something some of the organizers might have been open to. Harborfront Center wouldn't allow for these big kind of things, you know. That's my understanding. Mir-Djalali, if you want to correct me on that, please do. But that's an interesting distinction that I think this community partnership model enabled, for better or worse, that affected the way Iranian arts and culture was then represented to a general public.
Are there any other questions or comments? If not, I'm going to read one that I saw in the chat. Somebody asked about, Gita asked about how an analysis of differences along class and ethnicity aid in your study.
Oh, thank you for that. Right. So in chapter 5, I really tried to bring all of these case study chapters together in a comparative way through the lens of intersecting lines of belonging like race, class, and religion. And that's probably the hardest chapter to do because there was so much, you know, to pull into one. But one of the things that really ends up standing out is that in the United States, because there is not a federal multicultural policy, because there are not these kinds of community partnerships that are basically state intermediaries partnering with community organizations, there's not a funding support for these kinds of programs. And so those who have the resources get to decide what, you know, is represented. And get to kind of say who we really are. And I put that in those air quotes. And so there is therefore a very important class distinction between who was able to, you know, put forward those ideas in the US compared to in other parts of the diaspora. In Stockholm, for example, the Eldfesten event is over 90% funded by the Swedish National Touring Theater, which is funded by the Swedish state. So that's a very different kind of imperative that allows for different folks to be involved without having to, you know, pull their checkbook out and make it happen for themselves, right? They can make use of those resources. And so having the ability to make a statement about who we really are in the US often is very much intersected with lines of class, for example. I'll leave it there because I know we're running low on time, but very important question. Thank you so much for that.
Any other questions or comments? Let's see, I got to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Okay. Ustad Tawakkoli, do you have any questions or comments?
My final comments would be to thank Professor Amy Malek for brilliant, engaging, thought-provoking, and inspiring presentation. And it was truly brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the last of our spring 2025 seminar series. We will start it again in September 2025, and we look forward to seeing you.